It is such a pleasure to be here with you this morning and to be part of your Earth Day celebrations. I was raised not far from here on unceded Musqueam territory, a little ways south. I'm a middle child, and my sisters and I were raised in the United Church. We were raised with all of the deep religious and justice teachings of this tradition. And I have to say, we also were raised to be very polite. Not just pleases and thank yous kind of polite, but a sort of upper middle class, white Protestant, non-disruptive politeness. Maybe you can relate. We used to do a lot of family road trips in the summer up to northern BC or to visit family in the prairies, always with my youngest sister sitting in the middle the back seat. So we were taught to be polite, but we were also kids. And so sometimes out of boredom, my older sister and I on either side would sort of poke at my younger sister to try to get a reaction out of her. Jacqueline, my younger sister, is the most non-disruptive of the three of us. And in response, she would timidly say something like, "I'd rather you not poke me, but I guess if you really want to, then that's okay." So there were lots of situations in which my older sister and I were equally meek and cautious. It's a lesson that I've been trying to unlearn for many years. So 6 years ago, I was in seminary down in California, and I took a pastoral care class called Compassion and Moral Repair. Each week, we were assigned a spiritual practice to live with and reflect on for the week. It was a 12-week class, and in week 11, our assignment was to practice appreciating anger. I was, at the time, living in a collective house with 7 other people, so I had lots of opportunities to practice. But having been well-trained in politeness, even in that situation, anger did not come easily. Like any good education, my learning from that class continues to unfold. It continued to unfold for me a couple years ago at a national justice gathering of the United Church, the theme of which was the reading that we heard from Matthew, where Jesus arrives at the temple, casting out the money changers and overthrowing tables. And I love this story. The Bible that I inherited from my grandfather tells me that in his arriving at the temple and reacting to the business he saw happening there, Jesus taught those present, saying, "My house shall be called for all nations the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves." So I am an imperfect theologian. I want to tell you what I heard when I heard that. I heard Jesus saying firmly and resolutely, "This space is a holy place, and your business of valuing money over life is not welcome here." Which was striking to me because it's what I hear people across BC and elsewhere, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, saying all the time. I hear them saying, "This land, this place is sacred, and we will not allow your extraction, your money-making methods of desecration here." In response to this threat, Jesus embodied a holy and a righteous anger. But I was taught to be polite, non-disruptive. So when I hear this story, I wonder, how am I to react? When I hear the news, I wonder, how am I to react? In these climate-changing times, in the presence of commitments to reconciliation, amid ongoing repression and criminalization of Aboriginal people, in the witness of shrinking churches and weakening social fabric and demoralizing democratic structures, how are we to react? What are we being called to do? It is my understanding that we are facing an existential crisis on a scale that we have not seen before. The facts are in, and climate change is happening, and it is nearing a catastrophic tipping point. We don't know exactly how much time we have, except that every time the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produces a report, they find that we have less time than they had previously thought that we had, and every time it's within my lifetime. So I've been thinking and talking about the environment since I was a teenager, but I wasn't always so concerned about climate change. I remember when David Suzuki started talking about the top 10 things you can do for the planet. They were, pretty easy lifestyle changes, recycling, buying a bit more organic, bringing cloth, grocery bags to the store. These things that I think are the secular ecological equivalent of a private personal salvation, a sort of do your part, save yourself. 2 summers ago, I got to hear eco-theologian Joanna Macy speak, and one of the things that she said was this. She said, "There are a lot of nice people who are tending their gardens and caring for their children and trying to do their part, but they are caught up in this broken, toxic system, this late-stage capitalism in which these individual efforts are insufficient in challenging and changing the system." And I think she's right. In fact, even David Suzuki is no longer suggesting that these individual consumer and lifestyle choices, these private acts of salvation, are going to solve the problem, not fast enough. Increasingly, we are realizing that we need major systemic change. So I only recently began to understand the urgency of it all as I started to see pictures and hear stories of people across the globe already being impacted by climate change. Rising sea levels, drought causing crop failures, increased wildfires and storms at a strength and a frequency we have not seen before. I realized the urgency of it because thus far the people being most impacted by these disasters are poor folks the world over, and because in Canada the communities most impacted have been Indigenous communities already devastated by an atrocious history of colonization and residential schools. And I realized the urgency when I began to imagine the world that my stepdaughter and my new baby would be growing up in. So I have been trained to think about everything theologically. And climate change, I think, is the greatest theological challenge of our time. It is our role as people of faith to be naming the challenge and to be bold and courageous in showing leadership to address it. When I was growing up in the church, we talked boldly about injustice, but we didn't speak much about the environment. Now we do a little bit more, but we speak very politely. Rather than challenging power, we talk about consumer choices, recycling, and green sanctuaries and community gardens. We speak about doing the easier things, good things and important things, but what we call the low-hanging fruit. These are good things, but they aren't enough on their own. As people of faith, I think we need to be thinking bigger, more systemically. We need to be organizing within our communities and within our faith institution. We need to be playing to win, as my partner likes to say. Fortunately, we are not alone in this. Across the globe, people are finding their voices and speaking up against an economic and political system that diminishes them to mere consumers in a soulless market. More than that, they are speaking up in favor of alternatives that put people and the planet before profit. Theologically speaking, people are challenging this notion of a private salvation, and in its place, they are preaching a gospel of collective liberation. It sounds a lot like what I was taught in church sanctuaries, camps, and youth retreats, and these folks are preaching it with their hands and their feet, with passionate anger and strategic eloquence all over the place. The Occupy movement, the Maple Spring, the youth activist Dream Defenders in the southern United States, the Utsam Witness Project on unceded Squamish territory, the Vancouver-based Kids for Climate Justice, the Yinka Dene Alliance, 350.org, and Idle No More. As our creed reminds us, we are not alone, and we should draw strength from these groups as we too step up our game. So I've been heartened lately by the grassroots resistance and civil disobedience in opposition to many big infrastructure projects, including the Northern Gateway Pipeline and the Keystone XL pipeline, hydraulic fracturing, and the expansion of the Alberta tar sands, among many other issues. In 2011, you may remember that 1,000 people were arrested in front of the White House in coordinated acts of civil disobedience, drawing attention to the carbon bomb that is the tar sands, led by an organization called 350.org, and Bill McKibben, an author and a Methodist Sunday school teacher. And many of those arrested were there because of their faith. In our trained politeness, our non-disruptiveness, civil disobedience can feel very uncomfortable. But at this point, not standing up, not disrupting the system as it is, means supporting the status quo, and the status quo is immoral. So the Yinka Dene Alliance and the now over 130 First Nations who have signed the Save the Fraser Declaration have stood up too. They have formed an unbreakable wall of opposition to the Enbridge pipeline and to other similar tar sands projects. They are protecting their land and the migration route of the Fraser River salmon, and they are ensuring a future for generations to follow. They have been clear that they will stand in the way in every way necessary. Now, of course, there's a long and honorable tradition of this. Gandhi led and engaged in civil disobedience in the name of his faith, as did Cesar Chavez and Dorothy Day, as did Dr. Martin Luther King, and much of the civil rights movement. And, of course, Jesus engaged in civil disobedience, not just turning over tables in the temple, but challenging the unjust political and economic systems of his time. It is pretty central to the Jesus I was taught about. It is pretty fundamental to our Christian story. So I think we should be heartened too by the growing fossil fuel divestment movement. Launched initially by student groups on university campuses, the movement has grown to municipalities and labor unions and faith institutions. The slogan of the fossil fuel divestment movement is as simple as this: if it is wrong to wreck the climate, then it is wrong to profit from that wreckage. So far, 20 universities and colleges, 30 charitable foundations, 34 cities have voted to divest their funds from the fossil fuel industry. More than 65 religious institutions have voted to pursue fossil fuel divestment, including the World Council of Churches, Union Theological Seminary in New York, and the national body of the United Church of Christ in the US. The Church of England recently passed a motion to redirect its investments away from the fossil fuel sector to, quote, better align with the Church's theological, social, and moral priorities. And in February of last year, the Congregation of Trinity St. Paul's United in Toronto voted unanimously to lend its voice to the fast-growing divestment movement and to ensure that its own funds are not invested in any of the world's 200 largest fossil fuel companies. Trinity St. Paul's are bringing their motion to the United Church's General Council this August, and they are gathering support. The divestment campaign is a shift for a lot of institutions, including our own, who have long engaged in shareholder activism. The shift to divestment is being done with a recognition that if fossil fuel companies structured to prioritize profit were to release into the atmosphere more than 20% of their current reserves, it would be game over for the planet. Speaking about their divestment motion, Justin Whalen from Paddington Uniting Church in Australia described it as a little nudge to help them be the radical, prophetic people that they want to be. So I know that civil disobedience is an uncomfortable topic, and divestment may be even more so. But climate change is happening, it's worsening, our options are running out, our government isn't budging, and the call for action on climate justice could use additional moral voices, our moral voices. The church in my lifetime has lost its edge, I would say, and for that reason I think some of its credibility. Former United Church moderator Marion Best once explained it to me, she said, "We were devastated when stories started coming out about the residential schools. Previously, we had always seen ourselves as standing on the side of justice. Now we were implicated in the most atrocious of atrocities, and it broke us. Who were we anymore to speak for peace and justice after what we had done? And of course, who are we not to? There is a certain poetic appropriateness here because one of the keys to successfully tackling climate change and fossil fuel development is an embracing and a true recognition of Aboriginal rights and title, and in doing so, a making real of our promise of reconciliation. Climate change isn't primarily a technical or a scientific challenge. We have the knowledge and the capacity to address it. It is a profoundly ethical and moral challenge with huge moral implications. Oil dependence and overconsumption have polluted the soul of our country and furthered a physical and a spiritual disconnect from the natural world. As mainline Christian denominations are losing members and losing social license, now I think is the time for churches and people of faith to be bold in our proclamations of what a better world could look like. Fred Small, minister of the Unitarian Universalist First Parish Church in Cambridge, recently said, "With the civil rights movement, the youth led and the churches followed. The students are leading. Now is the time for religious institutions to follow." Amen.